Friends, I welcome all of you to the lecture series on ideology, political ideology. We are talking about socialism. Last couple of working hours, we have been talking about different dimensions of socialism. We have talked about revolutionary socialism, evolutionary socialism. Today's lecture is an attempt to understand another dimension of socialism, an important dimension of socialism. Friends, we are going to talk about Marxism. But before talking about Marxism, friends, it is necessary to understand Karl Marx, the man, just like we have talked about Gandhi, the man, before we were talking about Gandhism. So let us understand first Karl Marx, the man. Friends, the communist tradition is an important variant of socialism. What is communism? Communist is a tradition. Communism is a tradition within communism. Within socialism. Communists reject the very notion of private property altogether. They reject the very idea of private property altogether. They never believe in private property. Communists never believe in private property. They prefer common or collective ownership. Friends, historically, communism has been closely linked with Marxism. To be precise, communism is the organization of society through the abolition of private property. And the establishment of collective ownership. And friends, Marxism is a communism, a type of communism. The Marxist perspective of communism society is characterized by Classlessness. Classlessness means wealth is owned in common. It is also characterized by statelessness. Marxists say the withering away of the state. That is their terminology. So friends, within communism, we can say that there are three very important traditions. Keep in mind, communism is a tradition within socialism. Within communism, there are three important traditions. What are them? One, classical Marxism. Friends, that is propagated by Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Karl Kautsky, and the Russian theoretician called Georgy Plekhanov. That tradition is called classical Marxism. And there is a second tradition within communism, orthodox communism. Friends, orthodox communism is Marxism-Leninism. That is, interpretation given by Lenin to Marxism. Certain amendments to Marxism in order to practice Marxism in a real social situation. That is a second tradition within communism. Then there is a third tradition within communism that is called neo-Marxism. Friends, we don't have time to talk all these things within this short span of time. So we will be talking only about the first variety. What is it? Classical Marxism. Okay. Friends, strictly speaking, Marxism is a codified body of thought. A codified, keep in mind, it is codified body of thought of Karl Marx. Codified body of thoughts of whom? Karl Marx, which came into existence after the death of Karl Marx in the year 1883. Friends, Marxism is notably the writings of Karl Marx, along with his lifelong collaborator, you may know, Frederick Engels. Then Karl Kautsky as well as Georgy Plekhanov, who codified the thought of Marx into a systematic worldview. To facilitate the expansion of socialist movement all over the world. So, Georgy Plekhanov often says that Orthodox Marxism, that is classical Marxism, the Marxism of Karl Marx, not Orthodox communism. Not Orthodox communism. Orthodox communism is the interpretation of V.I. Lenin given to classical Marxism. Don't get confused, friends. Orthodox communism is interpretation given by V.I. Lenin to the classical Marxism. Then what is classical Marxism? Classical Marxism is the writings of Karl Marx along with his lifelong collaborator Frederick Engels being interpreted by, being codified by Karl Kautsky and Georgy Plekhanov. And Georgy Plekhanov says Orthodox Marxism can be portrayed as dialectical materialism. These are all abstract thoughts, friends. Only sharp mind can understand all these things. I hope you are all sharp minds. So Georgy Plekhanov says that Orthodox Marxism is, when I say Orthodox Marxism, keep in mind classical Marxism, the writings of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. Orthodox Marxism can be portrayed as dialectical materialism. And friends, keep in mind, Karl Marx never used the word dialectical materialism. The word dialectical materialism was used by Georgy Plekhanov. And dialectical materialism later became the basis of Soviet communism. So Soviet communism is Orthodox communism. Communism of Karl Marx being interpreted by V.I. Lenin. Some people argue that Karl Marx was an economic determinist, that he viewed the world in terms of economic activity. Man is known by the economic activity he is engaged. The toady topper, the goldsmith, the ironsmith, the carpenter. The society is men who works in professions. So people say that Karl Marx was an economic determinist because he had never seen a social domain in human world outside the economic activity. Best activity is economic activity, and all activities are shaped by economic activity. Man is known by the economic activity he is engaged with. So people brand Marx as an economic determinist. But friends, some commentators argue there are two Marx, there are two Karl Marx. Who are they? First one, the young Marx and the mature Marx. The young Marx was an evolutionary stage. The mature Marx was more complicated Marx who proposed most complicated ideas. And his best writings comes in the stage of mature Marx. But anyway, friends, the core of classical Marxism is the Marxism of Marx. The Marxism of Marx. And what is the Marxism of Marx? What is the Marxism of Marx? It is the philosophy of history, a philosophy of human history that argues capitalism is doomed, destined to die, will collapse, perish, and socialism will replace capitalism. And how they say this? Marx himself say, my communism is scientific. My communism is praxis. My communism is not opinion. Marx claimed his communism is scientific. That's why people say scientific socialism. Scientific socialism is the Marxism of Marx. Marx undertook a laborious empirical analysis of human history and society. He analyzed man in society scientifically. Thereby he claims he got insight into the future of social development. So, simply said, what is Marxism? Marxism is an attempt to gain historical understanding through scientific method. That point is very important, friends. Karl Marx used scientific method. Later, looking upon what Marx said, his famous collaborator Frederick Engels once famously said, Look, Karl Marx has uncovered the laws of historical and social development. That phrase is very important. He was saying that Marx has uncovered law, L-A-W, put in single inverted comma. Marx has uncovered the law of historical and social development. So friends, therefore, it's very necessary, it's very inevitable that we should know who the man Karl Marx was, before understanding his Marxism. Friends, Karl Marx was born in Trier, T-R-I-E-R, Trier, in the Rhineland, R-H-I-N-E-L-A-N-D, Rhineland, in 1818, Germany. He studied law at the University of Berlin, the university in Germany. During his student days, Marx was immensely interested in philosophy and political reform. His PhD thesis was released in 1841. The title of his dissertation was interesting title. The difference between the Democratian and Epicurean philosophies of nature. Very complicated, right? Very complicated. And Marx was looking to become a professor. He was interested in becoming a university professor. But that was blocked because of his own political views. These days, you will get appointments in university only if you are a left when the left government is in power, or BJP when the BJP is in power. Otherwise, you will never get appointment in university, because our universities are always politicized, where professors are appointed on political lines. Our only hope is PSC, right? If you are not interested in any political party, the only way you can become a college professor is PSC. And what happens if PSC is politicized? We can do nothing, right? We can simply cry. So Marx's ambition of becoming a university professor did not materialize, because his political views became a block, a stumbling block towards his ambition. So therefore, naturally, people who once tried to become university and college professor, when they realize that they will not be able to become college or university professor, the second option most people will prefer all over the world is to become a journalist, right? And the second preference, once you think that you are not able to become a professor, naturally you will end up becoming a journalist. That's why all journalists are against college professors and university professors, because envy, jealous, right? So most journalists always talk about university and college professors. That's what happens in our society. So Marx all of a sudden became a journalist. And he began writing for Rheinische Zeitung. Rheinische Zeitung in the year 1842, 1 year after he published his, PhD thesis, he joined a famous, German newspaper, Rheinische Zeitung in 1842, and he has become its editor. And Rheinische Zeitung, of course, when Marx become the editor of a newspaper, you can imagine that that newspaper will be censored. That newspaper will be blocked from publishing any news. And that happens. And we all anticipate that that will happen because its editor is none other than Karl Marx. So, Rheinische Zeitung was censored by the Prussian government because of its political views, because its editor is Karl Marx. So Marx resigned. So the newspaper is not going to release, publish any news. Why? Because its editor is such a, unfavorable to the political regime. So he became a persona non grata for the Prussian government. He became a persona non grata for the Prussian government. And friends, he went to Paris, the most famous city in the world. Almost all the intellectuals in the world finally end up in Paris because that is the paradise of intellectuals, writers, and all free-thinking people. And he went to Paris, where he wrote a famous book. In 1844, he wrote the economic and philosophical manuscripts. So Marx continued his criticism of Prussian government, and the Prussian government, then there was no Germany, the Prussian government accused Marx as a traitor. Marx as a traitor, and charged him with treason, and the Prussian government used its connection with the French government and persuaded the French government to force Marx to leave Paris. So Marx was again compelled to leave Paris. So all thinking people are, a persona non grata for all the governments in the world. So Marx was also a non grata persona non grata for the French government. Marx again became a persona non grata for the French government. And Marx went to Brussels. Again, when he was in Brussels, he was active in revolutionary activities in Brussels. So Marx was always a problem maker. When he went to Brussels, where he involved in revolutionary activities. And finally, in 1849, friends, a turning event in the history of Marxism, appeared. Marx, along with his wife and children, went to London. He thought that now the working class in London require my service. So he lived the rest of his life in London. He died in 1883, I told you. So he went to London in 1849. And friends, it was in 1844, Karl Marx began one of the ever best friendship between political philosophers that we ever know with Frederick Engels. So that is one of the what may be called a type of friendship which is rarely seen among men of philosophy, because men of philosophy are always egoistic. They always think, I am right, you are not. Because what I am saying is right and what you are saying is not. This is philosophers' attitude, intellectuals' attitude. Intellectuals will never tolerate other ideas, and they will say, my book is best, your is not. My idea is best, you are not. My ideology is best, yours is not. This is an intellectual attitude. And see, friends, but Karl Marx had such a lifelong collaboration and friendship with Frederick Engels that started in 1844. Frederick Engels was the son of a German textile producer. So his father was very rich, fortunately. The father of Frederick Engels was a rich person. And friends, anyway, the intellectual and literary partnership between Karl Marx and Frederick Engels successfully produced so many literary works. They have authored books like German Ideology, The Holy Family, and the most famous, The Communist Manifesto. And friends, Karl Marx lived in London. Engels lived in Manchester. Engels lived in Manchester. And Engels looked after the family business. And Marx used to write to Engels, and Engels also used to write to Marx, because both of them lived in two different cities. So there were voluminous correspondence between Karl Marx and Engels over the next 20 years. Between 1850 and 1870, both of them had written voluminously personal letters. And these letters are invaluable resources to understand how Marxism has been originally developed. These correspondence between Karl Marx and Frederick Engels are an important source, archival source for the development of Marxism. And friends, in the 1840s and 1850s, Marx proposed his critique of capitalist economic system, because by this time you already know Britain experienced industrial civilization. But friends, sadly enough, in England, Karl Marx and his family lived in grinding poverty. But their biographers say that although he and his wife struggled to keep up with bourgeois appearance, they struggled to keep up with the bourgeois appearance. Three of their children died in early childhood because of poverty, because no food. The death of his 8-year-old son, Edgar, because of poverty. He was not able to afford food. He died in 1855. Edgar died in 1855, his 8-year-old son. That was a severe blow to Marx. And in his letters to Engels, I have referred this for this lecture, that letter I have referred. Marx has written like this. Look at the poverty he suffered. The house is naturally desolate and empty since the death of the dear child, who was its animated soul. It is indescribable how we miss the child everywhere. I have already experienced all kinds of ill luck. I have already experienced all kinds of ill luck. But only now do I know what a real misfortune is. I feel myself broken down. Luckily, I have had such a wild headache since the burial that I have lost the power of thinking, hearing, and seeing. That's a letter to Frederick Engels, written in April 12, 1855. So, friends, his family survived through a combination of Marx royalty he received from a journalistic work, as well as the generosity of Engels. In a sense, it was Engels who financed Karl Marx. And in another letter written to Frederick Engels, which I have referred for you in this lecture, Karl Marx says like this: my wife is ill. I cannot and could not call the doctor because I have no money for medicine. For the past 8 to 10 days, I have been feeding the family on bread and potatoes. On bread and potatoes. And it is questionable whether I can get any more today. So look, friends, poverty, the real face of poverty Marx faced. So that's why, friends, Marx really experienced poverty. He really understood what does it mean to say no food situation. You might have seen last week there was a media report from Wayanad. Some of you might have seen in the news. I think it was in Malayalam Manorama channel. Few days ago, in Wayanad, 2 young boys were seen selling mushroom amid heavy rain. They were school-going children, friends. As media person asked, the boys started to narrate their miseries, just like what Marx told to Engels through the letter. The boys are brothers. They are selling mushroom for a living. But mushroom is not cultivated by the boys. It is given to them by a neighbor who knew the pathetic financial condition of these two boys. They had mother, but corona affected her job. She's jobless now. The father had already left the family and he had abandoned the children. So the boys are not able to attend online classes. They are living in a rented house, a hut like house. The boys are not able to attend online classes because there is no mobile. And they have also no time at all because they wanted to sell the mushroom they collect from the neighborhood. The travelers come by, purchase the mushroom, and the boys give the money to the neighbor, and the neighbor give the profit to the boys. Upon that meager amount, friends, these boys and their family is living. Their family is lives on a little money. Look the pathetic human poverty is. So, friends, Marx was very much aware of this poverty, the horrific face of the inhuman face of poverty. So, friends, in 1852 October, Marx sold his overcoat to buy paper. So, Marx experienced such a terrific scenario of poverty. So, it was in 1867. He had published Capital. Capital is a three-volume book, a trilogy. But volume second and volume third was edited by Engels and was published 2 years later after Marx was died. So the ideas of Marx and Engels, of course, exerted tremendous influence after their death. After their death. So what we know today about Marxism is basically is the works of Karl Marx and his collaborator Engels, which was codified by two other persons. I have told you, Karl Kautsky and Georgy Plekhanov. So the writings of Karl Marx is basically codified, interpreted by his followers, and proposed a systematic worldview about the demise of capitalism, about a stateless society, about the birth of communist society. So Marxism is a different form of socialism. A different form of socialism. Marxism is a different form of socialism. One second. So friends, sorry for the inconvenience. So what I'm saying is that Marxism is a different approach in socialism. And you can say Marxism is what Engels called the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. Marxism is materialist conception of history or historical materialism. It rejected the idealism of German philosopher Hegel, who believed that history evolved. History evolved through the unfolding of the so-called world spirit. And Marxism rejected this idea of history. That is a dominant idea. What Hegel said was a dominant idea, which was rejected by Marxists. And Marx proposed a different approach to society, to understand history, to understand society. Throughout his writings, he had written so many things, so many books. So the crux of his writings is that you have to adopt a different approach to history, a different approach to understand society and man. And friends, this idea was, later, as I told you, elaborated by Kautsky and Plekhanov. The world calls Marxism. But purely speaking, Marxism is the Marxism of Karl Marx, or otherwise called classical Marxism. But there is a second version of Marxism, orthodox communism, and third, neo-Marxism. But that doesn't fall into the scope of this lecture. I will talk about classical Marxism next day, tomorrow. Friends, now the floor is open for discussion. If you want to say something, please